And unfortunately, I don't know how this started or why, the media, like almost, with precision accuracy, whenever an issue comes up, well, you have to, have fewer guns in America, it's too easy to get guns, they inevitably say, well, there's a Second Amendment and you can't violate that, as if the Second Amendment is as absolute as the First Amendment. But if you look at the language in the Second Amendment, it talks about the people's right to bear arms so they can serve in a militia. That's a lot different than every person, unless they have a criminal record, and even sometimes then, being able to go out and buy, semi-automatic. And I think the media could be much more of a help if they accurately reported that although there is a Second Amendment, it's in no sense an absolute prohibition on the government regulating arms. Again, it's Republican talking point. Anytime there is a mass shooting, now's not the time to talk about this. Well, when is the time? I mean, if ever there's a time, that would be the time. And, I'd like to see the other Democratic candidates, because John Kasich notwithstanding, I think Republicans are basically hopeless on this issue, meaning they haven't done much of anything. I mean, I don't know who the last Republican was who did anything, worthwhile, I don't know, maybe, okay, everyone says Lincoln, okay, maybe Eisenhower built some highways. But, the truth of the matter is, as far as gun violence is concerned, they've done, nothing in the past 20, 30 years. So I think that the 2020 presidential campaign needs to embrace this issue. Because there are like contradictions woven in, to for example, the NRA's position on the one hand, they're indeed authoritarian, and they use techniques of propaganda that comes right out of Joseph Goebbels' playbook. Joseph Goebbels was Adolf Hitler's minister of propaganda and popular enlightenment. At least they were honest in terms of what they called him rather than the press secretary. So, they do use these totalitarian moves, and yet they claim at the same time, and this is very deeply woven into the NRA credo, that what they're doing is they're fighting for democracy, because somehow the right of every citizen to bear arms is essential in a democracy, because somehow that prevents the government from imposing its will on us. Which again, maybe that was true in 1791, when the amendments were first passed, but it's not true any longer. I mean, the fact of the matter is the government has such massive, overpowering weaponry that no citizen army can possibly stand up to it. So it's totally illogical, but yet it's attractive to some people. And, this again is part of the almost paradox that runs through a lot of our politics. Why would any person, and this gets a little bit away from gun violence, but it's part of the same issue, any person who is struggling economically, say in the Midwest, say because they were put out of work because the car company they were working for got more mechanized, something like that. Why on earth would any person in that situation feel some kind of kinship to the Republican Party and vote for someone who's a billionaire, or at least he says he is, and all the other things that comes with the Republican Party? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. I think we have to recognize that, however, and the solution to that, or the best remedy, comes with at least being clear-eyed about that happening. And the NRA, unfortunately, typifies that, because, again, we can see that what they do goes contrary to democracy and freedom. I mean, if you live in a place where you can just you're walking down the street and you can be killed instantly by gunfire because there's some kind of fight going on. And again, this has nothing to do with a mass shooting. This is just what happens in the streets of Chicago and other big cities. How are you free? So how could the Republicans and the NRA, which emphasize freedom, possibly support guns? And the only thing I can say as far as the media, we need people in the media who recognize that and make that point. And, the good thing is, I think most human beings do have an inherent rationality, and if they hear the truth often enough, eventually it begins to seep through. And, what the opponents of change always want to do is shut people up as much as possible. And so that's why they assign those names. They stigmatize people who have any views that oppose their views. And, it's not easy. But, the only way to break out of that is to just keep talking and keep talking. No. Phones that have video cameras in them have made it much more difficult for police to get away with their violence. I mean, obviously they still do to a large extent. But Rodney King was the first time that it was not just an eyewitness or more than one witness seeing the police beat somebody up who shouldn't have been beaten up, but fortunately for society, not fortunately for Rodney King because he was severely beaten, but somebody had a video camera. This was back in the early 1990s. But that was still a rarity back then. How many people had video cameras that they would just happen to look outside their window and they could make a video of it? So the combination of video cameras in everyone's phone and increasing pressure on police to carry with them in their cars and on their person their own video cams, they can still get away with it. But part of the problem, to indicate how serious it is, you can have evidence that's obvious right in front of a jury's face. They'll still find the officer not guilty. In other words, it's like, I don't care what the evidence says, this officer is not guilty. So that's still happening. But I think little by little, we are having some progress in that area, restraining some of what the police do. There was a very important case, I think his name was Alexander Arbuckle, that arose during the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations. And basically, this had nothing to do with gun violence, but it has everything to do with the way police operate, including, unfortunately, even here in New York City. Arbuckle was basically covering a demonstration. The police were ordered to clear the park. The demonstrators said, well, we have a First Amendment right we're peaceably assembling. And then an officer came over to Arbuckle, because Arbuckle was, basically recording what was going on and covering it, saying, you have to stop doing that. Arbuckle said, no, I have a First Amendment right as a reporter. So he was arrested, and he was charged with disorderly conduct. But what neither Arbuckle or the police knew was that there was another guy by the name of Tim Poole, who I actually had guest lecture in my class after this happened. And it's one of these, rare but, very inspiring, heroic stories. Arbuckle was brought up on charges. The trial began. The defense attorney called Tim Poole up, who basically showed his video of what he saw happen, and it was obvious that Arbuckle didn't in any manner, shape, or form engage in disorderly conduct. So the charges were dismissed. So I think ultimately the best way of dealing with police not telling the truth, distorting what they say they have on video, even manipulating the video, is crowdsourcing and the videos that everyone takes. And, there's a lot of criticism about phones and, they're intrusive on our lives and, there's no such thing as privacy anymore. I get that. But I think that there's another important other side to the story, which is that these phones that we all carry provide mirrors of everything that's going on around us. And I think that can be helpful and has been helpful in terms of keeping aggressive police in check. And there's a very significant historical example in the television coverage of the Vietnam War. Nobody liked the coverage of the Vietnam War on television. People who were in favor of the war, they didn't like it because they thought it was making people more critical of the war. But people who were against the war also didn't like it for that reason that you just indicated. They were afraid it was going to breed apathy. Every day you see these bodies on the screen. The public's going to sort of begin just blanking out. So it was a tragic situation which provided, though, a good experimental case. And it turned out, we know what happened with the Vietnam War. Eventually, the television coverage got someone like Eugene McCarthy to run against Lyndon Johnson, got Robert Kennedy to run against Lyndon Johnson, eventually turned the majority of people against the Vietnam War. And although it took way too long, eventually we got out of Vietnam. So that wasn't completely because of what television did, but I think most media historians would say that television's coverage of the Vietnam War in the 60s actually helped the United States ultimately do the right thing. So again, there's a history, unfortunately, of things that are bad and damaging becoming symbols of attainment of power. So like one of the best or worst examples, depending upon how you look at it, is, by the late 1950s, early 1960s, the public began to become aware that smoking was not good for you. And, eventually there were warnings on cigarette packs and so on. And there was a very disquieting discovery made at the end of the 1960s, going into the 1970s, which is that smoking in general had begun to decline, except among young women who basically was smoking because it was a kind of empowerment, because for so long it was thought somehow it wasn't ladylike to smoke. And by the 1960s, that wasn't the case anymore. And so you had, people doing things that weren't good for themselves simply because they felt it empowered them. And I think, unfortunately, guns are the same. And usually, news media tell more of the story than entertainment media, since the purpose of a show on an entertainment network is to amuse and entertain, not to inform. But it turns out, I think, that when you look at the issue of gun violence, although you're completely right that the news media tend to focus almost exclusively on the mass shootings, which are horrendous, but at the same time, they rarely, if ever, report on the day-in, day-out toll that guns take. Gang violence, people commit suicide, just this plethora of guns and violence that we're saturated with here in the United States. And I think somewhat ironically, the entertainment media do focus more on those other issues. So if you watch just about any cop show on any network these days, Chicago PD, FBI, a relatively new show, and not to mention the shows that deal with violence and cops on various streaming services. I just finished watching the 5th season of Bosch, and it's about an LA detective. I think it's an excellent show. But the point is, those programs do tend, maybe not completely realistically, because again, their prime purpose is to entertain, but they actually, I think, show a much more accurate picture of gun violence in America.